History is full of stories that were never supposed to remain mysteries. A vanished colony. A ship discovered without its crew. A coded manuscript no one can read. A strange signal from deep space. Ancient structures that still raise questions about the people who built them. For centuries, these mysteries have been surrounded by legends, theories, and impossible explanations. But what if some of history's greatest mysteries aren't supernatural at all? What if the truth is hidden beneath layers of incomplete records, human mistakes, political decisions, natural disasters, and stories that changed every time they were retold? Tonight, we're going behind the legends. Because sometimes, the most disturbing explanation isn't that history contains something impossible. It's that history contains something perfectly possible, that someone simply failed to explain. Before we begin, subscribe to Xyromist and turn on notifications, because the deeper we go into these mysteries, the more you may realize that history isn't always about what we know. Sometimes, it's about what disappeared between the lines. In December 1872, an American merchant ship called the Mary Celeste was discovered drifting across the Atlantic Ocean. The ship was still seaworthy. Its cargo was largely intact. Food and supplies remained aboard. Personal belongings were still there. But the captain, his family, and the entire crew were gone. There was no obvious evidence of a violent struggle. No bodies were found. And strangely, the ship itself had not simply sunk. It was still floating. It was still capable of sailing. But there was nobody left to control it. The mystery quickly became legendary. Some theories suggested pirates. Others proposed mutiny, alcohol fumes, sea monsters, or even supernatural forces. But the truth may have been much simpler. One possibility is that Captain Benjamin Briggs became concerned about the ship's cargo of industrial alcohol. A leak could have created dangerous fumes or made him believe an explosion was possible. If he believed the ship was temporarily unsafe, he may have ordered everyone into the lifeboat. That decision could have become fatal. If the lifeboat became separated from the Mary Celeste, the ship could continue drifting while everyone aboard the smaller boat disappeared into the ocean. There is no definitive proof that this is what happened. And that's exactly why the case remains unsolved. The mystery may never have required a ghost. It may have required only one desperate decision followed by terrible weather. More than 2 centuries before the United States existed, English settlers attempted to establish a colony on Roanoke Island. The colony struggled almost from the beginning. Supplies became scarce. Relations with nearby indigenous communities were complicated. Survival was becoming increasingly difficult. Eventually, Governor John White returned to England to obtain supplies. But political problems and war delayed his return. When he finally came back years later, something extraordinary had happened. The settlement was almost completely abandoned. There were no obvious bodies. No massive battlefield. No clear evidence of a massacre. Instead, one mysterious word had been carved into a wooden post. Croton. For centuries, the disappearance became known as the mystery of the Lost Colony. Some believed the settlers had been murdered. Others claimed they had disappeared into the wilderness. But historians have increasingly considered a more realistic possibility. The colonists may have separated into smaller groups and joined nearby indigenous communities. They may have moved because of food shortages, environmental pressure, or the need for protection. If that happened, the colony didn't vanish in a single dramatic event. It slowly disappeared. Families merged. Names changed. Children grew up in different communities. And eventually, the original settlement disappeared from the historical record. The mystery may not be about where the colonists went. It may be about why their identities became so difficult to trace. Then there is a manuscript that has confused researchers for centuries. The Voynich Manuscript contains unfamiliar writing, strange diagrams, astronomical illustrations, unusual plants, and bizarre drawings. Nobody has conclusively determined who wrote it. Nobody has successfully decoded its text. And nobody knows exactly what it was created for. For generations, cryptographers have attempted to solve it. Some believe it contains a forgotten language. Others think it may be an elaborate cipher. Some researchers have even suggested that the manuscript could be meaningless. But scientific testing has revealed something important. The manuscript itself is genuinely old. Its parchment dates to the early 15th century. That doesn't tell us what the writing means. But it does tell us that the mystery is not simply a modern invention. Perhaps the manuscript represents a private medical system. Perhaps it contains an obscure scholarly tradition. Perhaps the text is encrypted. Or perhaps it was created for a very specific audience whose knowledge disappeared long ago. Sometimes history doesn't destroy information. It destroys the people who knew how to read it. In 1901, divers exploring an ancient shipwreck near the Greek island of Antikythera discovered something that changed our understanding of ancient technology. Among statues, coins, pottery, and other artifacts was a heavily corroded bronze object filled with gears. At first, it looked like ordinary debris. But researchers eventually realized that it was something extraordinary. The Antikythera Mechanism was an ancient calculating device capable of representing astronomical cycles. Its gears could model celestial movements and predict astronomical events. For a long time, people assumed that sophisticated mechanical technology belonged mainly to much later civilizations. The mechanism challenged that assumption. It demonstrated that ancient Greek engineers possessed remarkable mechanical knowledge. But it also created another mystery. If such technology existed, where were the other machines? The answer may not be supernatural. Mechanical devices were built from materials that could corrode, break, or be recycled. Most ancient machines simply didn't survive thousands of years. The Antikythera mechanism may therefore be less of an impossible exception and more of a surviving example from a technological tradition that once had many more pieces. History can make an entire civilization appear less advanced simply because its machines didn't survive. In 1959, 9 experienced hikers died in the Ural Mountains. Their tent was discovered partially buried in snow. The hikers had apparently escaped from it under extreme conditions. Some were found far from the campsite. For decades, the Dyatlov Pass incident generated theories involving secret military experiments, strange lights, unknown creatures, and supernatural forces. But modern investigations have provided much more grounded possibilities. One explanation involves a slab avalanche. A relatively small movement of snow could have damaged the tent or created the perception of immediate danger. The hikers may have cut their way out rather than using the entrance normally. They then moved away from the tent, possibly expecting to return once the danger passed. But darkness, freezing temperatures, difficult terrain, and poor visibility turned a temporary emergency into a catastrophe. Some suffered traumatic injuries. Others died from hypothermia. The tragedy may therefore have resulted from a chain of ordinary events. And that's an important lesson about mysteries. A mysterious death doesn't necessarily require a mysterious cause. Sometimes several small mistakes combine into one catastrophic outcome. In 1966, 2 men were found dead on a hill near Niterói, Brazil. They were dressed formally. They wore waterproof coats. And they had homemade lead masks covering their eyes. Beside them was a notebook containing strange instructions. There were no obvious signs of violence. There was no clear explanation for why they were there. The case quickly became connected to UFO theories and secret experiments. But the surviving evidence does not prove any supernatural explanation. The men may have been involved in an unusual spiritual or scientific experiment. They may have believed they were protecting themselves from radiation or another imagined danger. Their deaths could have resulted from poisoning, accidental exposure, or a medical event that investigators could not determine at the time. The masks make the case unforgettable. But they don't tell us what happened. They only tell us that the two men believed something unusual was going to happen. Whatever that belief was, it ended with both men dead on a remote hillside. Another ancient mystery comes from the island of Crete. The Phaistos disk is a clay object covered with symbols arranged in a spiral. It dates back roughly to the 2nd millennium BCE. The symbols are unfamiliar. Their meaning remains uncertain. Some researchers believe the disk represents a writing system. Others question whether it was intended to be read in the way we imagine. Perhaps it represents a very specific local system that was never widely used. Ancient writing systems could disappear quickly when civilizations collapsed. If only a small number of people understood a particular language or writing system, the death of those people could make the entire system unreadable. Imagine discovering a computer containing thousands of files but having no password, no operating system, and no knowledge of the language used to create them. The information would still exist. But without the key, it would be almost useless. The Phaistos disk may be something similar. The answer could be sitting directly in front of us. We simply don't possess the cultural key required to recognize it. In 1977, scientists detected an unusually strong radio signal from space. It lasted approximately 72 seconds. Astronomer Jerry Eman examined the computer printout and famously wrote the word "wow" beside the signal. The event became one of the most famous possible extraterrestrial mysteries in modern history. But there is an important detail. The signal was never detected again in exactly the same way. That makes its source impossible to identify with certainty. Researchers have proposed astronomical explanations. Others have suggested unusual reflections or interference. The extraterrestrial hypothesis remains exciting. But there is no confirmed evidence that an alien civilization sent the signal. The mystery isn't proof of extraterrestrial intelligence. The mystery is that scientists observed something unusual and never received enough information to reproduce the observation. And in science, one unexplained event isn't the same thing as an explanation. In 1518, something bizarre reportedly happened in Strasbourg. Hundreds of people began dancing uncontrollably. Some reportedly danced for hours. Others continued for days. The event became known as the Dancing Plague. To modern audiences, the story sounds almost supernatural. But historians and researchers have suggested an explanation involving mass psychogenic illness. The people of that period lived under extreme pressure. Food shortages, disease, religious fears, and social instability were common. Under severe psychological stress, people can develop real physical symptoms. When one person displays strange behavior, others can unconsciously imitate it. The result can become a group phenomenon. That doesn't mean the people were pretending. Their suffering could have been completely real. The mystery may therefore reveal something more interesting than possession or magic. It may show how powerful the human mind can become when fear spreads through an entire community. Few historical figures are more famous than Cleopatra. Yet the location of her tomb remains uncertain. Ancient sources suggest that Cleopatra and Mark Antony were buried together. But despite centuries of searching, archaeologists have not conclusively identified their burial place. Researchers have investigated possible locations around Alexandria and beyond. The problem is that Alexandria itself has changed dramatically. Earthquakes, rising sea levels, erosion, and construction have transformed the ancient landscape. A tomb that once stood in a recognizable location may now be buried beneath centuries of geological and human change. This is one of history's most frustrating realities. Sometimes the evidence hasn't disappeared. It's simply underneath something else. When we look at these mysteries together, a pattern begins to emerge. The Mary Celeste doesn't necessarily require ghosts. Roanoke doesn't necessarily require mass murder. The Dyatlov Pass incident doesn't require monsters. The Voynich Manuscript doesn't require alien knowledge. The wow signal doesn't prove extraterrestrial contact. And ancient technological discoveries don't automatically mean lost civilizations possessed impossible abilities. The real explanation is often more complicated. History is incomplete. Records disappear. Languages become extinct. Buildings collapse. People die without explaining themselves. And witnesses misunderstand what they see. Then, centuries later, we inherit fragments. A ship. A manuscript. A carving. A strange signal. A photograph. A body. A few sentences written by someone who was there. And from those fragments, we attempt to reconstruct the truth. But there is another danger. Every generation adds its own story. A mystery becomes a legend. The legend becomes a theory. The theory becomes a documentary. And eventually, people begin remembering the theory as if it were fact. That is how historical mysteries grow. Not necessarily because the original event was impossible, but because every unanswered question creates space for imagination. Perhaps the greatest historical mystery isn't what happened. Perhaps it is how much we will never know. We want history to have endings. We want the missing person found. The ship explained. The ancient code translated. The tomb discovered. The final clue identified. But reality doesn't always provide closure. Sometimes there was no surviving witness. Sometimes the evidence was destroyed. Sometimes investigators arrived too late. And sometimes the truth disappeared with the person who knew it. That's why the greatest mysteries continue to survive. Not because they have no possible explanations, but because none of those explanations can be proven completely. And maybe that's the real truth hidden behind history's greatest mysteries. The past isn't a perfect record. It's a broken puzzle. Some pieces are preserved in museums. Some are buried beneath cities. Some are sitting inside forgotten archives. And others may have been lost forever. We can study them. We can investigate them. We can build theories. But we must also accept the possibility that some answers are gone. Forever. And perhaps the most haunting thought of all is this. Somewhere in history, there may have been a person who knew exactly what happened. They knew why the ship was abandoned. They knew where the missing people went. They knew what the strange symbols meant. They knew what caused the mysterious deaths. They knew the truth. But they never told us. And now, we are left searching through the shadows of their silence. If you enjoyed this journey through history's greatest mysteries, subscribe to Zyra Mist for more unexplained cases, forgotten secrets, and stories where the truth is buried deeper than the legend. Because sometimes, the mystery isn't that history has no answers. It's that the answers may still be hiding somewhere, waiting to be found.